Hello and welcome to OT, the podcast. We're here to talk about watches, time, and how to spend it. I'm Felix Schultz.
And I'm Andy Green. Felix, how you going?
Yeah, pretty good, mate. It's miserable weather in Melbourne at the moment.
Yeah, rain. I haven't been outside during the rain in a little while. I've managed to sort of dodge it the last couple of weeks, but it's well and truly here. It's gloomy.
Yeah,
it's wet.
I was out of Melbourne on the weekend, and I was in a place where the apparent temperature was -4.
Yeah, that's nippy. Any snow?
Just nothing so picturesque. Just cold. Speaking of snow, I suspect that today's guest, Aaron Stark, has encountered snow in his lifetime. Certainly the subject of his book, Disrupting Time, some Swiss industrial espionage spies of the turn of the century would be familiar with snow. It's a pretty universal concept. But we have a good chat to Aaron, who has written this sort of historical narrative history, of shenanigans, which maybe weren't so innocent as they first appeared.
Yeah, a lot of tidbits came out of this chat with Aaron, especially around like sort of the espionage side, the sort of the insecurities that the Swiss had around the US, and just, I mean, history's told us how that sort of battle played out, but kind of interesting. And I do like diving into sort of the more research angles of the watch industry every now and then, as opposed to sort of constant breaking news.
Yeah, I just also like the whole concept of industrial espionage. It seems, I guess it's a real thing, but to me it only exists in like 90s thrillers with Japanese corporations.
It's alive and there's a long-standing history in the watch industry. It comes in many shapes and forms, but we're not going to talk about him just yet.
What are we going to talk about, Andy?
We've been busy. We've had a couple of events in the last week. First up was IWC here in Melbourne. I think we talked about you being up in Sydney for the engine oil launch. Came down to Melbourne, which is our home turf.
Sure.
We had the pleasure of inviting a couple of OT supporters down in person, which was cool to meet a few of the guys out of Discord.
Can I tell you something even cooler?
What's that?
There were OT listeners that we didn't invite there.
Yes, that was a little... I did message you afterwards, and I was like, Felix, I forgot that people actually cared about what we say.
Well, I don't know if they care about what we say, but they listen to it at least.
You'd hope that they care.
Even. I was chatting to a guest, and they said that they bought an Artem strap. Totally, definitely, absolutely because of us.
Well, speaking of, I believe Artem Strap are supporting this week's episode of OT the podcast.
How's that for a seamless segue? Yes. This chap that I had a chat to hadn't got his hands on the green loopless strap yet, which honestly he was missing out.
So we've gone from seamless to loopless. You're a big fan of the loopless Artem Strap, artemstraps.com. You can get it, or you can check out pictures on artem.straps on Instagram. Why do you love this strap so much, Felix?
Well, I mean, I sent you another pic. I've been rocking it on the yellow dialed Halios for a sort of casual vibe. I've just made the shift, thanks to the convenience of drilled lugs, onto the Grand Seiko, the champagne dial. Pretty dressy. I mean, it's not a dress strap. It's not like a, alligator strap by any means, but it goes well on a more dressy watch. So if you've got a
Lux,
date just or something like that, that sort of, everyday casual dress watch, I reckon it would do that pretty seamlessly too.
I can wear that down to your yacht club without getting rejected.
Oh, the yacht club on the Maribyrnong River. I'm sure there is one.
If it keeps raining, you'll probably need a boat to get into the city. Speaking of Grand Seikos,
you've stolen my Grand Seiko hookup.
A grand introduction.
Yeah.
I went up to Sydney last week for a Friday night event, the launch of the GS9 Club in Australia and New Zealand.
What's the GS9 Club, Andy?
It's sort of like the Grand Seiko Owners Club that sort of exists in other parts of the world, and the Australian Grand Seiko fam have been requesting it for some time, so they finally have brought it here, had a big party to celebrate. So
the party looked very nice, Japanese restaurant, Natch. Mm-hmm. My one question, and I asked this on an Instagram because I wasn't able to go. I was devastated. Why was there a Ferrari there?
I think that might be one of the guest car. No, I just think that was just a nice, luxurious element to have in.
I wanted a Nissan.
I wanted a Nissan too.
I wanted some sort of Paul Walker too soon.
Could have been, yeah. I did question did make a joke that it might have been the brand manager's car, but you know who I did meet there? Mr. Grand Seiko. Finally, Daniel Yong, after years of being.
Are we allowed to out him? I think he's pretty out there.
He's pretty out. Champs from Watch Advice was also there, and a bunch of sort of OG Aussie watch community from the Sydney kind of cohort, a lot of Caliber 61, if you know, you know.
Sure.
So that was cool though. They had the last of the Australian edition, that pink dial flower boy that they did. Was that last year? It would have been last year. So they were sort of opening up an auction for that, which will probably, I think it's the first week of July, so we can link up details in this episode's show notes. But you basically get the watch, you get a bespoke strap to match, and then you get, from the watch designer, some artwork that they did, like a sketch of the watch.
Sketch sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of concept. It's more artsy than just concept. So it's pretty cool. And yeah, proceeds going to charity. So that was cool. They had, live music, whiskey tasting, a ton of people, especially notable for a Friday evening, which was cool.
Did it make you? Did you see any nice Grand Seikos, or did it make you? Because you famously have never owned a Seiko, Grand or otherwise.
No, but yeah, I mean, it's
closer.
I was pretty close when that pink dial came out, just to kind of keep that narrative going with our love for pink dial watches. I think one day. I think the door's not closed at all. Sakura, they're still around. They're still kicking around.
Okay, all right.
But on my flight, Felix.
All right.
I did a few things.
What did you do?
Flew. But I also, you were talking about LA Confidential. It came up in my thing. So I watched it on my flight. Watches are a pretty prevalent part of that film.
What is?
Watches.
Yeah, he's got what?
Bulova.
The main guy, Guy Pearce. He wears what appears to be a terrible fake Rolex.
Yes. Oh, I don't think it's fake. I think it's.
Don't reckon?
No, I don't reckon it's fake. But there's a Bulova, the possibly fake Rolex, and there's another. But the way they sort of integrate the watch, like the different watches, several times into the sort of the film is quite interesting. Like they're quite important.
Sure.
Markers.
I mean, I guess in a period piece setting, old timey LA, you have to establish continuity without phones and stuff. So it's a great film. Highly recommend it. It's on Netflix. Did you watch anything else, Andy Green?
I did. So I also started watching the Smartless documentary.
What is this?
Which I think is on possibly Binge or Apple TV. It's on Apple TV. It's one of them. Okay, so at the start of the pandemic, we weren't the only people to start a podcast. Shit. Sit down. Get a glass of water. There were other people. A couple names you might know: Will Arnett, Jason Bateman, Sean Hayes. You know who that is?
No.
Will and Grace.
Oh yeah.
There you go. They decided to start a podcast as well. I think they might have heard OT and then thought this is cool, but we need to bring some stronger names in. Yep. So they did their podcast, them chatting, them doing Zoom calls, pandemic vibes, and each week they sort of started bringing in a surprise guest. So only the person who invited the guest knew.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's a good concept. I like that.
Yeah, except you can imagine who,
Yeah, probably better than our guests.
Hey. But then as the pandemic eased up, they sort of did a couple of live shows, which is something maybe we can think about. Oh, I guess we're already doing as well. They're just copying us. They're just copying our live show because we did a live stream for Cartier. So again, we walked so that Jason Bateman and Will Arnett and Sean Hayes could run. Anyway, so they decided to go do live road shows, sold out crowds like we would have, but they made a documentary about going to do the shows. And so a couple of different, episodes or performances they have, like Will Ferrell comes out. I just watched one that had Matt Damon come on the stage. They had Mark Cuban, and it's all black and white. I don't know why it's all black and white, but it's just like a really nice show to watch. I think because you get those like behind the scenes interactions, which I guess if you're a fan of a podcast or you support actors or whoever, it's kind of nice to see how they interact when they're not doing the job or doing the thing or performing. And you get a lot of that. Like you get a lot of just like really funny interactions between, three, famously funny individuals. And it's just, it's a really nice time.
Okay. I mean, seeing some bits of it on TikTok, I think. I'll check it out. Production values. It's what everyone wants. It's what costs money. You know what else everyone has been talking about this week in the world of watches? We should have some news. By the time this is published, Andy, Only Watch will have gone live, which I guess people still care about.
Mm-hmm.
But the big news from now last week, Riri wore a Jacob & Co. watch around her neck.
She did, and that sort of backfired.
You we had a lot of vibrant discussion in the old OT Discord. Again, get on the OT Discord. It's where
Join up.
vibrant discussion happens. I just don't think people who talk about this on Hodinky's Instagram and comment section are the people it is for.
So why did Hodinky put it on their Instagram? I guess that's what people were upset with.
Traffic, you know.
Yeah.
It's pretty controversial. They know it would drive engagement. You're the social media guy. I don't need to tell you this.
You think they're just... So you think it was deliberate? You think they knew what they were doing?
Who? Jacob, Rihanna, or...
Hodinky. You think they knew that they were going to get that?
100%.
You guys fell for it. You fell for it, you suckers.
They're not going to go,
Oh, no.
Did we post this lovely vintage Breguet today or this Jacob & Co. worn by Rihanna? We need to drive the engagement a little bit. Which of the two options should we go for?
Tricksters, absolutely. Yeah, I did like the thing. I think we both saw it, but it was Flavor Flav responding to someone was like, "Oh, the first time a watch has been worn as a necklace," and Flavor Flav just retweeted it, being like,
"Yeah, it was the account like Hip Hop History or something that." He's like, "You don't know your history." That's pretty good. But look, honestly, and besides, I don't hate it as a look for like a high jewelry watch, which is essentially, you know, an exercise in gem setting where they've put it around a watch movement.
Yeah.
They often, you know, come as like cuffs or as necklaces or as other things anyway. I don't hate it. I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, fair enough. There's been some other news though.
What's that?
New Omega.
75 years of Seamaster.
SMP, Ploprof, probably the place to start.
Yeah, I mean, I would have started with my general feelings of underwhelm, but maybe
start with them. Start with them.
I don't know. I don't have much to back this up. It's pretty fresh news at time of recording. It looks like a collection with a bunch of color themed dials. It's fairly pretty.
Yep.
Is that it?
I feel like that is possibly it.
Cool.
The Ploprof. So. Again, it's sort of back. Was it discontinued?
There was a model that was, I think they got rid of it in steel.
Yep.
And had only titanium. Is it back in steel or?
I think it's back in steel, about 15,000 US. Like it's very expensive.
It's
graduated sort of blue dial. So that's probably one of the more historical models.
They look good. The Seamaster 300 looks good. They all look good.
They're not. Hey, at the same time, they are kind of being fairly innovative, I guess, with their dive watches, and they've kept things affordable. Like they're still expensive, but they're more affordable than a lot of other kind of players in the field.
Yeah. Well, fair enough.
Do you think you're just underwhelmed because of this sort of the new cycle? Just you weren't expecting it?
Honestly, I think it was, I don't know. It was maybe a little bit of the international launch was all very luxy lux. Like, you know, Ben Clymer was there. You know, it's good.
Yeah.
It was in Mykonos and it all looked very bougie. And the launch didn't necessarily live up to the an anniversary of a collection for that sort of thing, it didn't feel proportionate to me.
Do you think they think 75 years is a big deal?
I mean, it's better than 82 or 64, which is, you know, what we normally get for these, you know, we're celebrating the third anniversary of the watch designer's second wedding, you know.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. You go, is 70 years a big deal? But 75, like where do you draw the line between what they actually think is?
I reckon 50, 75 and 100. They're the big ones.
Yeah, fair.
25. Fair. I think your quarters are genuine. The 50 and the 100 are the ones where you go out. I don't know. Like,
it's all just very blue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's underwhelmed. I'm just underwhelmed. And
Maybe
maybe
in person. I feel like the Plo Prof might get you in person.
yeah, crap week to launch a submarine themed collection too.
Yes. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, poor
Interesting.
timing. Speaking of underwhelming, Andy,
Uh-huh.
I put a last minute sort of question, a hypothetical, because you sent me a watch made by like a one off sort of artisanal watchmaker who, let me just pull it up. We should give him a shout out.
F. Ronson.
F. Ronson, like a sort of old school skeletonized hand winder. My response was, "This is not your usual bag, Andy Green."
No, so it's kind of like a skeleton dial with what looks like gold
A gold
as
nugget.
a nugget that's been sort of used to create the bridges
Yeah.
of the watch, and then it's got a kind of white gold in a, I guess, rehort.
Yeah.
Sort of really, and it's got like a molten look to it. Even the hands kind of look like they're sort of blue and melted. Like it looks like it was solid and it sort of melted away. And it got served to me. I thought, this is quite interesting and quite cool.
So where I went in my head with this is, what is a watch you'd be least likely to buy? You know, as always with these, money is no object. You know, like I know you're good for stainless steel sports Rolex all day, every day, and pink dials every other day.
Mm-hmm.
What
Just a
would
watch I would never buy.
Well, I mean, what would be like, whoa, Andy Green's gone a Jurg Benzinger.
Oh, okay.
You know?
Oh, so it's like I'd be least likely to buy. Not,
Yeah, at least not like a watch you would never ever buy, but like what
okay.
sort of. And for me, that's you. Like I see and I could be wrong here. You buy things. You're quite, and I don't mean this as an insult, conservative in your watch tastes.
Mm-hmm,
like you go for the blue chip brands. Like you're always talking about Cartier. You're always talking about Rolex. You're always talking about Patek. These sort of guys. I can see you doing a lot of stuff in that space, and I can see you going crazy with that. But I can't see you going, you know what? I'm going to take a chance on this one-off little independent watchmaker that's making an 80,000 Swiss franc watch.
Oh, okay. This is Sarpaneva.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one where I think it would surprise you. You'd be like, oh,
You'd
wow,
never
that's cool.
buy it, or you would buy it, but it's unexpected.
Yes, yeah. Or
Okay.
I think my original answer for this question, which is the Rolex Pearlmaster, because I think I would never ever buy it, but then at the same time, it would be pretty
You'd
funny.
be buying it to get the authorized dealer spend up.
No, like it'd be pretty funny to have a gem set Pearlmaster, just because I feel like if you stared at it long enough, it might look good to you. What about you?
The ones, the Patek, the highly jeweled Nautiluses that they sort of sold as women's watches that everyone's jumped all over.
Yeah, with the wavy dial.
Yeah, they're great. I can see that. Yeah, I can that's a great example. Like of you just sort of going silly money spend on a Sarpaneva, like one of the Mooney ones or the Moomini ones.
Moomin?
The Moomins?
Oh, any. I would probably get. I think they're all sort of custom, made to order vibes. So I'd probably get something either very pink or very green.
Nice.
Bespoke to my tastes. What's your answer?
I think something that I can never imagine myself wearing is a watch which is all about the complication. Like Arm and Strom, for example. The resonance. Jacob & Co., like the ones with the central tourbillons. I can't. Technically impressive, amazing, incredible, love what they're doing, pushing the genre forward, whatever it is. I can't imagine wearing it.
Yeah, you've got strong feelings, Arm and Strong. You have like an instant.
They just don't do it for me.
Got an ick, an Arm and Strong ick.
No, I wouldn't. I don't think I'd ever buy one. So I mean, it's not least likely to buy. Maybe Rolex.
Yeah, I would be pretty surprised if I saw you with a Rolex. If it was an Explorer too, Polar.
If I just settle down for a sub. No,
Anything
if I bought a Rolex, it'd be some sort of Datejust or something in two-tone.
Actually, yeah, Datejust wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah,
these days.
Essentially, all my watches are a variant on a Datejust these days.
Goodness me. Well, speaking of dates, we've got a
history.
We've got a date with history.
Let's get Aaron on.
Let's do it.
Andy, today's guest is Aaron Stark, author of the book Disrupting Time, Industrial Combat, Espionage and the Downfall of a Great American Company, which honestly is, I think, all you really need. We're hooked at that point, but on top of that, Aaron is a former assistant professor of economics at West Point and Army veteran. Welcome to OT, Aaron. How are you this fine morning?
Great. Thanks a lot for hosting me, and excited to be here.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Bright and early for you. Before we get to your book, in the broadest possible sense, what's the appeal of watches for you and how did that start?
Yeah, so I think earliest memory I have is when I was a kid, I owned a Fossil watch, and I've loved watches ever since then. I really got into it when I was in graduate school. I started running a blog at the time, writing about the business of watches, and it was called Watch Ponder. And I did that for a couple of years and did some writing for some other blogs and really kind of got me thinking more about the industry. And I think what really fascinates me about the watch industry is when you think about it, it's like the most regionally associated product in history. I don't know if mathematically that's correct, but we all consider it as wholly aligned with Switzerland. There's not a whole lot of new innovation that's taken place in watches since the 1800s. Now, obviously, there's lots of things that have improved and they've continued to do new materials and whatnot. But when we think about like the actual timekeeping, watches in the mid 1800s kept time at about the exact same accuracy that watches do now. So the actual innovation hasn't really changed a whole lot. And then when you think that these watches are able to extract, tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes even more from customers, and many of them you can't even buy if you wanted to. That kind of creates this like really cool product. And then when you look at the historical aspect, timekeeping is like central to the development of the economy, the timing of railroads, scientific management, even in warfare and synchronization there. And now, of course, we block our days in these 30-minute segments. And obviously, us three coordinated a exact time to meet, and we all showed up at exactly the right time. And so all of that is, to me, has always been really fascinating when you kind of combine all of those things and how central they are to our lives and the continued development of the economy and the development of society.
Yeah, and thank you for getting up so early to join us. It's 6 a.m.
Of course.
6 a.m. in Buffalo, New York.
We couldn't have done it without international meeting calculator or whatever the
I thought you
website
meant
is.
our world timer. Obviously, you're here to talk about, your book. You're going to dive into a bit of a watch industry mystery spy saga. We're going to talk about that in a second. But you also sent over a review of your book, Disrupting Time. And with that, it kind of brought back some fond memories. In particular, there's another book about S-Town, and I want to start there because it's sort of like one of the original watch mysteries for me. Anyway, as podcast came out in 2017, I think it was honestly the first podcast I ever listened to, and I did it on a web browser. But are you across S-Town? Was that sort of a mystery that's on your radar?
So I'm familiar with it. I haven't actually listened to the podcast. Funny enough, that review that you mentioned is somebody that I've become familiar with in the watch community. He's a very well-respected, writer in the watch community that wrote that review. And so when I saw that was in parallel to the review of my book, I thought it was very exciting to see his review there as well.
Well, yes, as a big fan of that podcast, and I'm going to go re-listen to it. I know Felix is across it as well, but you're in very, very good company. And it's sort of, for me, it was the original mystery in sort of the watch industry.
Absolutely. Hey, you were talking before, and I've been sort of sitting in the background here thinking about it, that watches are the most geographically specific sort of certainly like a serious national industry we can think of. The only other one I can think of, and it's got a lot of parallels, is whiskey. Like that's sort of quintessentially Scotch, but it's also not. Like heaps of other places make really good whiskey, but you associate it with Scotland. And that's all about, they're all about history and tradition and, they're super unobtainable and they resell for crazy amounts of money. So I'm sure there's some economic parallels there, which, I don't know, maybe that's something we can dive into later. I'm really fascinated by your sort of the way you think about watches or the way you've sort of talked about them, because economics, time, and history, they're sort of, you've put them together in a really, really literal way. Like individually, they're all important, but I don't think people think about the economics of time over history, like the economics of the watch industry. So what was the kickoff for you to sort of put those dots together and start working on, I guess, disrupting time, or, you know, any sort of serious writing projects around the economic history of watches?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple other people who have begun to look at these. One of my favorite historians that in horology history is a professor by the name of Alexis McCrossin out of Texas. And she's done some great books. She has a book called Marking Modern Times, and kind of talks about the idea of timekeeping entering our consciousness and beginning to schedule our days around it. But I think what really kind of set me on this story that we'll talk about was just this idea that, you know, we kind of have this idea in our mind that Switzerland has always been the best watchmakers. And when I first began reading on this topic, it struck me as that's actually not true. It is something that we've come to believe and that we just assume. But when you actually look back, it was, you know, the English were the best watchmakers, the Germans were the best watchmakers, the Swiss were the best watchmakers, and then the Americans, and then the Swiss again. And the Swiss kind of maintained that beyond that into the present. But as what we find is that this kind of narrative that we assume isn't exactly what happened. Mm-hmm. And that's what really interested me to want to dig into this deeper is, how did that come about and what led to it? And then when I came across this company, the Waltham Watch Company, that again, we'll talk about more in detail, there's a lot of things about them that struck me as like all these things that we assume now with like the modern tech company that, mm-hmm. you know, is progressive, takes care of its employees. They know how to do creative sales and creative marketing. We kind of think of those as like modern things that are in our current environment, but not something that happened 150 years ago. And I hope that came across in the book that that's not true. These companies actually did know how to take care of employees. They were extremely progressive. Waltham, even by around 1900, and it may have actually before this, they actually had on-site childcare because they had so many women employees that they had to have on-site childcare. And there's a really cool picture that I can send you, or is also on my website, aaronstarkbooks.com. You can see this picture of the nursery circa 1910. Wow. So I think that those are kind of the things that struck me about this story in particular, is it just really went against what my general understanding of the history of the watch industry and just history of economic development in general.
Okay, well, I think Felix and I both have a bunch of detailed questions all relating to sort of writing a book, where you start, how you research, how you fact check it. But maybe we just get into what the book is about. So it's called Disrupting Time. It sort of tells the story of a couple of Swiss spies commissioned to kind of steal American watchmaking techniques. Can you kind of explain, give us the top line?
Sure. Yeah. So it tells the story of these two gentlemen, Jacques David and Theo Gribi. Mm-hmm. And they were maybe not necessarily intended to be spies at the start. Theo Gribi came to America as a judge for the Centennial Exhibition in America. It was this great World's Fair in 1876. He sees America's technology and he writes back to Switzerland with alarm and essentially says, you know, we've been left behind. He says, I'm completely overwhelmed by what I saw. And so the Society of Jura Industries, which is a trade association representing the business interests of Western Switzerland, sends over an additional expert to join Gribi, and his name is Jacques David. And David is an engineer, and he also works at a watchmaking company, but he's very interested in mechanized production. So he comes to America, and they have this charge from the SIIJ to acquire any information they can about American watch companies, including their technology, their operations, their production, basically how to operate a business. So they come over to America. They acquire these secrets over about a 3-month period. David heads back to Switzerland in November, as does Gribi, and he documents it in this 130-page report. They then use this information. David, in his report, kind of lays out a pathway for Switzerland to industrialize its watch industry. And so part of what the book then does is traces how David's actually able to use that and how Switzerland uses that to industrialize watch production, and shows how influential of a character David really was. And so in a nutshell, the book covers the rise of Waltham, the Swiss infiltration, the industrialization of Swiss watchmaking, and then the strategic choices over the next 25 years or so, which I term as kind of industrial combat, as it's very intense, and ultimately shows that the Swiss have this sound strategy that far surpasses the Waltham Watch Company's impressive economies of scale. So that's the book in a nutshell.
The initial sort of things that I wonder about this book, so with not the book, the story, the broad sort of characterization of these guys as, spies, or they're doing industrial espionage. How overt and like deliberate were they in saying, okay, we want you to like steal? Were they break into the factory and, get schematics of, James Bond level stuff? Or was it like, do a fact-finding tour, find out what you can, see what they're up to? Like, where were they on that sort of spectrum?
Yeah. So I think this is kind of one of the breakthroughs. So David's report, when he comes back to Switzerland, he asks them to keep it secret. And there was a couple practical reasons for this. He says in his report, we have these sources and we don't want to compromise them. The factories would, basically deal with them if they knew they were helping us. And then he also doesn't want the Americans to get it, because there's another famous guy named Fave Perret, and he comes back from the Centennial Exhibition, and he's also a famous Swiss watchmaker. And he writes this speech that the Americans get a hold of, and they publish it in newspapers everywhere, and it basically just talks about the dominance of the Waltham Watch Company. And so David says, we can't let that happen. So he requests this thing remain secret. And it does. It remains secret until about 1992, when it really kind of enters as a facsimile copy. There's 1,000 copies made of it as a more of a commemorative edition. And then in 2003, it gets published in an English translation, which is available now. You can actually find it on the internet. I linked to it on my website. And that's when it really, the name Jacques David actually becomes prominent in watchmaking history, but not until 2003. So when you kind of say, well, where on the spectrum, a lot of people would have, the conventional narrative up until 2022, 2022, when I published my book, was that Jacques David wasn't a spy. He was a person who was curious. He came, the Americans naively shared this information with him. He took a cordial tour, and, we have nobody to blame but America for giving him this information. I came across this letter that Jacques David wrote when he was in America back to the SIIJ. And David begins to say all the quiet parts out loud that he doesn't say in his report. His report gives us enough to indicate there's more beneath the surface than he's telling us. But then in this letter, he actually talks about using disguises to sneak into the factory incognito. And he says, I didn't really have time to have a good look around nor to ask questions. But then he says, we have inside sources and we shall soon have the information we want. So then the next kind of big breakthrough is nobody knew who gave David these sources. And in fact, in the translation, it says, we'll never know who David's sources were. Well, in the letter, we actually find out who one of them was, and it's a blockbuster. It turns out it was literally the number 3 person at the Waltham Watch Company.
Wow.
One of the early founders who brought mechanization to Waltham was a guy named Ambrose Webster. and he had come from the Springfield Armory helping make firearms, and he brought the idea of mass production to Waltham when he joined the company. Ambrose Webster is like a very storied employee in pocket watch circles.
Yeah.
And if you talk to people into Waltham history, they love Ambrose Webster. And in David's letter, he tells us that Mr. W, the former director of the mechanical side, is helping us figure out all this information. And so we find out Webster is actually part of this. And sure enough, in his report, David recommends that all the Swiss buy watchmaking equipment from Webster, who leaves Waltham in 1876 and starts his own company. So we find there's kind of this coordinated arrangement, or probable coordinated arrangement, between the two. So that was kind of where we are in the spectrum. We definitely know they recruited agents. We definitely know they used disguises to go in the factory. So I hope that answers the question.
What I find fascinating here is, and I think I probably know the answer a little bit, but why do you think this story wasn't told in detail until now? Like, why do you think, 130, 140 years ago, it's only just coming up now?
Yeah, I think there's the practical reason, which is, the Swiss were worried about this report getting out and it just remained secret.
Famously,
but I think there's also the marketing reason. It doesn't really fit into the story of Swiss watches as we know it. And I think a good way to think about this, when I was doing my research, I found I really I was curious, like, am I the first person? And turns out, no, there's somebody else who's called David a spy. And it was a 1987 Swiss academic article. There's a little biographical paragraph talking about the development of watchmaking in Switzerland. And it mentions Jacques David. Keep in mind, in 1987, most people wouldn't have known who Jacques David was. His report wasn't even really publicly released until 1992. So the fact that he appears in an article in 1987 indicates that his name has been passed down in some respects. And in this article, the Swiss academic actually calls him a real industrial spy. So that was kind of my first confirmation that he is, like, people knew he was a spy. So then my book kind of becomes the first one to actually tell the story of what happened. So I think, to answer your question, why it doesn't appear in there, even though we know he's a spy, this concept of Switzerland not always being the best watchmakers is something that counters people's understanding of the history of Swiss watches. And we know that's not necessarily true. As the book shows, America was actually on track to dominate the global watch market in the mid to late 1800s. And I think there was a podcast that did a review of my book, and the host says, and there he goes, it very much does upset a few marketing narratives, and it casts the industry in a different light. And I think that kind of sums up well why, it's just a story that we haven't seen appear in the narratives about the watch industry.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we're getting to a point, or maybe we've always been at a point, where we are starting to see more complex narratives from Swiss marketing departments more broadly. Like they're starting to accept that people are interested in this, and that it's more than like my great-grandfather Jean-Pierre found a stable and turned it into a watch factory. So I hope that they sort of take this on board, because honestly it's more interesting. Like, if you can tell me a story of Swiss spies in America, that's far more interesting to me than, I don't know, whatever sort of marketing fables come out of most brands. I'm all for it. But my question was the research process for this. How did it go? Like, I imagine you're dealing with, sort of Swiss French, and you're based in America, and, the archives of this, or the physical records, I'm assuming, are on, in Switzerland. What was that sort of process like?
Sure. So the book focuses, I would say, mostly from the American perspective of the Waltham Watch Company. So the Swiss side of the records, a lot of them have been translated. As I mentioned, the David report is 130 pages. And then there's actually been quite a bit of academic work written on the rise of the Swiss watch industry from, post-industrialization, so the 1870s, through the present. So there's quite a few scholars. There's even a book that this is kind of an anecdote I used to show, how David has really kind of entered the lexicon of research. Is if in 1983 there was a book by a guy named David Landis, who was a Harvard historian, and his book is, people recommend it to you, and it's called Revolution in Time. There is no mention of David or his report in Landis's book. Fast forward, there's one of the most prominent historians now is a gentleman named Pierre-Yves Donze. And Donze's book is titled History of the Swiss Watch Industry from Jacques David to Nicholas Hayek. So here we've gone from nobody's heard of David in 1983 to now his name is part of the title. So that's how much he has become a central figure in watchmaking history. But as far as the sources, a lot of people have done research and published on that on the Swiss side. So the rise of the Swiss is very well known. What is not as well known is the Waltham Watch Company and its failure. There's a lot of books written on Waltham. However, Waltham survived until about 1950. So a lot of books will focus on Waltham's, what I kind of term its terminal decline, which is from about 1900 until 1950. And the reason 1900 was a demarcation point is at that point, Waltham was no longer a dominant force in the global watch market. They still produced a lot of watches, but strategically, the Swiss owned the market. Excuse me. And so as far as getting access to Waltham's records, those were conveniently located at Harvard Business School in their archives, where I was attending at the time. And so I was able to access those and literally read through all their annual reports, all their ledgers, all of that from about 1857 to 1900, and just see what were the ideas and what was going through the minds of the executives. It was all very nicely captured. And so that was how I began doing the research to really do archival research. And then as far as the 1876 centennial that I mentioned that Gribi went to and was a judge at, those records are actually maintained in Philadelphia.
Sure.
The city archives there. So I went down to the city archives and spent a day going through all of the Swiss records from the centennial.
Yeah, right. We've talked a lot about like American watchmaking, and I think, that sort of story of American industrialization at the later half of the 19th century is fairly well known. I mean, there's lots of, stuff out there, and, Waltham, sort of Hamilton below over those guys. I am interested in what your take is on why they couldn't sustain it. Like, my understanding of that narrative was that the war effort, or both war efforts, I suppose, really sort of changed their production focus and, put the industry into decline. Is that inaccurate, or?
No, it's not inaccurate. I think the reason that I kind of put most emphasis on the period, we'll call it from 1850 till 1900, is this is the period before you have any interference from either subsidization or any formations of production blocks or anything like that. Obviously, when the wars come around, those result in a lot of government funding as well. So when you do prior to 1900, you don't really have any of those interfering, so to speak, with the performance of the companies. And so we're able to look at Waltham as America's production leader versus the Swiss watch industry in its most pure form. And as what we see here is Waltham chooses this strategy early on of cheap and reliable watches. They want to make watches that the middle-class customer can afford, but is reliable. And it turns out that their watches are actually far superior to the Swiss watches, even by the 1860s. And that's what leads to their rise as Americans realize, hey, I no longer have to buy an expensive Swiss watch. I can actually get a reliable watch, and watches begin to infiltrate society, especially at the conclusion of the American Civil War. So as the American Civil War ends, a lot of these soldiers have acquired watches during the war, and they begin to take them with them. And that's where we begin to get this idea of the cheap and reliable watch. And Waltham continues to focus their strategy on it. Meanwhile, the Swiss, they come to the 1876 centennial, and they realize that Waltham can completely dominate the watch market with this cheap and reliable production. And so then they begin to make strategic choices. They do mechanize and they do begin to form factories, but they realize they're never going to compete in America on a cheap and reliable watch. So they choose to focus on international markets, and they mostly stop sending cheap and reliable watches to America. And so that cedes the market to Waltham and its American competitors. Then the Swiss realize that they also need to be able to produce luxury watches. They say, hey, we have this army of horologists. Let's make luxury watches. And they managed to make that decision right at almost the perfect time. This is the Gilded Age. It's the rise of the robber barons. People begin getting enormous sums of money, and they want what other people can't afford. And so the Swiss watch becomes the preferred watch of the wealthy, despite Waltham having this, cheap and reliable watch. And so the Swiss strategy of focusing on luxury watches and avoiding the American market turns out to be a windfall for them. And meanwhile, Waltham is battling itself and battling its competitors such as Elgin, who are also trying to focus on cheap and reliable. And Waltham ends up in this price war. And we find going even into the 1920s, there's a good documented report where they say cost and price of production is of utmost importance now more so than ever, even though for the last 50 years, they've been focusing on price and costs. And so Waltham basically enters this spiral where they're always trying to make their watches cheaper, but eventually they just can't make them any cheaper. And they continue to invest in heavy equipment that becomes a burden for them that they can't overcome. And the most iconic folly is because they've spent so much on equipment, when the wristwatch phenomena begins to come around in the 1880s to 1890s, the Swiss are still transitioning. And so they're looking for new products. So they adopt the wristwatch and they begin to invest in it. And those of you who follow Rolex, we know that Rolex comes around right at the beginning of the 1900s, and they commit wholly to wristwatches. Meanwhile, Waltham, they are slow adopters. And part of this is because they have invested so much money in new equipment to mass produce pocket watches, they can't afford to make the move. And so Waltham eventually transitions to wristwatches around World War I or right after that. But they can't compete because the Swiss already are known for this and they dominate the market. So while Waltham continues on, they enter bankruptcy in the 1920s. They restructure. They manage to survive until the early 1950s. They do another series of restructurings, but they were never a dominant force in the watch market beyond 1900.
It's fascinating. It's sort of fascinating to see how it all sort of played out. And just sort of, I feel like something like this would be really easy to get like lost in the detail of like spies and costumes and I guess the micro, and it must have been really hard to pull yourself out back to like that macro level because, you're talking about decades and decades and decades and international markets. But what was something that really kind of surprised you, going through the process and what I imagine was quite a lot of research?
Yeah, I think to me, the thing that was the most fun was figuring out almost what nobody else has seen before. So I think that Ambrose Webster discovering his involvement was maybe the most exciting to be able to see that. And just the first time reading it and putting the connections together, like, wait a minute, I know this guy and I've seen this name before. And then realizing what ends up happening. So Webster, when he starts his company, when he leaves Waltham in 1876, the Swiss do end up buying all these things from him. And Jacques David in his report says, buy from Webster. And there's a newspaper article from the 1890s that talks about, Webster's so successful, he's literally been to every factory in Switzerland. So we know Webster benefited from this. And so to be able to like put those pieces together, I think has been fun. but also just to like put yourself in the shoes of these two gentlemen who, came to America. And, we say industrial espionage. They wouldn't have even known what that term was. It wasn't illegal back then, nor was the term industrial espionage even in the lexicon. That didn't even come around until around World War I. So just to like put yourselves in the shoes of these gentlemen who were asked to come get this information to help the survival of their industry, and then being able to go back and have this really impressive guy, Jacques David, who actually knows what to do with the information, and he actually motivates an entire industry to move from artisanal towards mechanized production, was fascinating.
I imagine, I'm willing to be proven wrong, but I don't think I will be, that pocket watch guys are pretty, take the history pretty seriously. Has there sort of been acceptance from like the guys that, hold sort of Webster and Waltham up and have a particular understanding of what went down? Are you challenging that? And has that been taken on board, or have you had some pushback?
I would say not a whole lot of pushback. Probably the biggest thing I found is there's, people who know way more of the details than you or I will ever know. And so those people will frequently, send me a note on, this aspect of your book forgets, this detail, or you overlook this detail. One example is I talk about the Waltham's use of the soldier's watch, the Ellery model, and how it rises to prominence during the American Civil War. And somebody didn't appreciate that I didn't note in there that Aaron Dennison, who is the original founder of Waltham, who went bankrupt, shortly after he founded it, and then this other guy, Royal Robbins, buys Waltham from him. Somebody didn't appreciate that I didn't explain that Aaron Dennison actually designed the Ellery model, and it wasn't Royal Robbins who designed it. And it's, those are details where it's like, this is a good point. But the book is not designed to explain every aspect of watch history.
Yeah.
And so I'll frequently tell watch enthusiasts, like, it may not actually be the book for you if you're really into every detail of Waltham's history. But I think probably the coolest thing I got, or the coolest comment, was somebody who is a Ambrose Webster fan and who I respect as a, kind of a father of history in Waltham, told me, he's like, I've seen Webster, I've read about Webster for decades, and the connection that he was with the Swiss, like that, just like it should have been in plain sight to me, and it just never occurred to me. And so I thought that was pretty cool to be able to help somebody who has studied Waltham for their entire life be able to put those connections together. So I would say you get a little bit on both sides.
I reckon you've probably got a pretty good sort of canned response already. I think one of the coolest things about this sort of history is, or any history really, is what it can, shine a light on today. Do you think that there's any sort of, in the last few years we've seen, the Swiss get all stressed about the Apple Watch, and you've got similar sort of crises of national, industry. Is it relevant today what Jacques David was doing, or those fundamental lessons?
Yeah. So, I think probably the biggest takeaway, and really the macro theme of the book, is really the dangers of industrial espionage and how those impact a company. And I think, going back to this idea that industrial espionage is not new. Some of the most famous targets of industrial espionage are porcelain, silk, and then even textiles. And one of the anecdotes I bring into the book is, the Americans stole the secrets of the textile industry from the English. And so when people will say, well, is this, what does this say about the Swiss watch industry? I always say, well, what do clothes and textiles say about America? And most people would say nothing. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, the fact that industrial espionage occurred, it's not that anything bad occurred or anything good occurred. It's just that this occurred in an era for which it was very common for its time. But what it does show is that there is a cause and effect. And people say, I was surprised to see that Waltham didn't fall right away. Well, we actually know that modern research shows that's a very common outcome of industrial espionage. Very rarely does it directly lead to a competitor's downfall.
Yeah.
It's not like the Swiss or whoever in this case could come out with a watch that's like the exact copy of Waltham and they're just going to make it so Waltham can't compete. That's not what happens. Is what happened here is it allowed the Swiss watchmakers to have near perfect information and then be able to outcompete Waltham at their own game. And so that takes a couple decades to truly have an effect. But as the book shows, by the end, when we go into the 1890s, Waltham has basically shut themselves out of all the possible markets and all the ways out of this situation they've put themselves in. They've blocked all those avenues, and a lot of them, unfortunately, had been blocked by the Swiss. So even if Waltham wanted to compete, so for example, they say, we'd love to be able to compete in the luxury market, but we can't. We just can't sell watches. Nobody wants to buy our luxury watches. Meanwhile, the Swiss are enjoying their reputation now as the world's best watchmakers of luxury watches. So Waltham's ability to compete has been cut off. So I think that is kind of the true story of the book, is that there are harbingers of industrial espionage. The watch industry just happens to be an example, but there's other examples we can look at, the textile industry being another prominent one.
Yeah. I don't know if you're working on a sequel yet, but I would be fascinated to sort of get your take, or if there's similar stories, because I'm sure there are, about, maybe 100 years after this, in sort of a neat parallel with Japan and Switzerland, because there's a lot of, the post-war industrialization of Japan was very rapid, and that they quickly started freaking the Swiss out in all sorts of ways. So I don't know. I'd love to find out stories of subterfuge involving Seiko and other brands.
Yeah, for sure. No, the watch industry continuing on is there's all these fascinating chapters of its history. I haven't gotten to those yet, but no, that's a good idea.
Yeah, fascinating. I think there's, this isn't the end of the spy watch saga, especially good timing, as over, I think, the last year or so, Felix and I have become, and a lot of people have become, massive fans of a mysterious Instagram that goes by Watches of Espionage, I should say.
Yes.
Which is the former CIA agent, or maybe current, who's kind of shares these little tidbits and of, story time and photos and intel that's obviously not classified. What do you think? I mean, and this Instagram account has like over 100,000 followers. Like it's probably one of the most interesting thing in watches, and has been to me anyway for the last year. What do you think the appeal is with this whole spy narrative?
Yeah, I think, obviously just going to the idea of James Bond is kind of where all of our minds go, but, asking yourself, why is James Bond so popular? And it's, kind of the idea of adventure and kind of this alter ego, or this alter life that you can live. And when you think about this, Watches of Espionage, or even when we look at Omega and how successful they've been with the James Bond watch franchise, is this idea that you can kind of bring that identity to your wrist. And I think, watches themselves have had a huge following in the military, and obviously even kind of the intelligence community, as you've mentioned there. Watches are a thing. And coming from the military myself, I always thought of it as, it's like the one thing that you can put on your wrist that you can wear around that is different from everybody else. So while there might be requirements that you can't carry this, or that you always have to wear this, watches are something that you get to pick, and you get to pick which one is your identity. And, why would I be willing to pay extra money for a James Bond Omega Seamaster versus a regular Omega Seamaster? On one hand, you could say it's just marketing, but I think for people who own those watches, it's somewhat of an identity of, you're identifying with this idea of adventure, and this idea of, I'm doing something cool. And I think that is where we kind of had this intersection of why espionage and why watches have such a interesting intersection is it's this idea of focusing your identity, but also what the idea or our image of espionage involves.
Everyone loves like that spy tie-in, don't they? Just add spies into the mix.
Well,
Yeah,
got
exactly.
the world's attention.
it's kind of like the perfect example of like, watch brands say, your watch can do this, it can do this, it can do that. And these are people that are sort of, them and explorers and deep sea divers are a great example of people wearing a watch as an actual tool rather than a, expensive iPhone replacement or whatever it is. Aaron, it's been lovely to chat to you and learn about the economic history of the Swiss watch industry, something we could talk a lot more about. As you know, we're going to ask you for something not related to your work at all, not related to watches at all, a recommendation of something you've been enjoying or, consuming to pass the time. What do you got for us?
Yeah, so I've recently read 2 books that I thought I would recommend if you're into reading. The first one is called Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard. And the reason I like this one is she actually opens the book talking about the Centennial Exhibition, similar to my book also touches on the same World's Fair. But it actually then talks about some of the scientific developments coming out of that and focuses around one of America's presidents who was unfortunately assassinated in the 1880s. But she talks about a lot of the early technologies they used to try and save his life. And it's kind of a story of science, but also it is a story of development. And so really enjoyed how she's able to weave those together. The second one is a book called Ghost Maps by a gentleman named Stephen Johnson. And here he actually is able to look at an outbreak in London. If I remember correctly, it's cholera. And he is able to look at this, and he basically uses modern analysis to kind of pinpoint where this, and he traces kind of some, early investigations they did to try and pinpoint where this outbreak had started and why it was spreading. And he talks a lot about how this disease spread through the city and then how they ultimately prevented future outbreaks. But again, using kind of a modern view and modern investigation of something that happened, 150 years ago. So I found that one really interesting as well.
Amazing. Well, both recommendations are to read more, and I'll reiterate this: Aaron Stark, AaronStarkBooks.com, Disrupting Time. Go check it out. I have downloaded the Audible to kind of hear some sweet narration as I drive 5 hours. So should get me through a couple of weeks of commuting. Aaron, thank you so much for joining Felix and I. Thank you for the great chat and for the great recommendations.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Enjoyed it.
Our pleasure. Felix, what a well-spoken, well-researched, well-mannered individual.
Well. That's all I have to say. What a tale. Of course, we will link up where you can buy Disrupting Time by Aaron Stark. What else will we link up? Arnhem Straps. We will link up our Discord. We will link up our Instagram. What's that again, Andy?
ot.podcast. Tag us in all your watch picks. If you want to email us, otthepodcast@gmail.com. Please remember to give us 5-star reviews and keep telling your friends and family about this show, especially in their positions of power at brands and want to sponsor and support us.
Yep.
If you want to fly us out to our watch event, or just to any event, weddings, a party.
Mitzvahs.
Yeah, we're there, we're available, and we're quite competitive as far as...
I reckon we'd be all right on a bar mitzvah hosting scene.
I think we could absolutely... There's only one way to find out. Guys, we'll see you next week.
Yes. Chat to you later.